Hello, everyone, and welcome to a new edition of the Dexory webinar and the first of 2025. First of all, Happy New Year to everyone. I think I'm still definitely allowed to say that for a couple of weeks. And here's to an exciting one to really pushing the boundaries of this fascinating industry of warehousing and logistics across 2025. I'm not sure about everyone kind of listening in, but at Dexory, we have a couple of months that are absolutely full with events coming up, such as Manifest and Promat in the US, Logimat in Germany, Intralogistics here in the UK, and many others. So very excited to see you all over the next couple of months in person as well and show you all the Dexory technology in action. But before the madness of the year really kicks in, what better way to start than discussing some of the key trends and expectations of the industry for the year ahead and even beyond? And who best to do that with than Clare Bottle, CEO of the UK Warehousing Association and one of the top voices of the sector across UK and I would actually say probably Europe soon as well, with a fantastic experience spanning almost 3 decades in the industry. So absolutely kind of knowing all the ins and outs of what everything that we do and we talk about day to day. So Clare and the UKWA quite recently published a fantastic white paper that's called The Warehouse of the Future, Predictions from 2025 to 2050. So quite a span ahead and kind of things to look forward to. And we also recommend reading it and we'll post the link here as well. Today, Clare and I were going to talk a little bit about some of the key themes highlighted in the white paper and the findings before them. But before that, Clare, welcome to the Dexory webinar.
Hi, yeah, thank you for having me, Oana, and Happy New Year to you and all of your viewers as well.
Thank you so much. So to kick us off, I mean, the white paper is based on learnings that you captured across this incredible adventure that you had in 2024 of visiting 80 warehouses in a year. I think that's based on the 80-year anniversary of the UKWA. So maybe just a quick thought, like how did you find that challenge and how was it to, try and kind of literally kind of go across the country so quickly?
It was brilliant. It was absolutely amazing. Really, really fun experience. So I kind of felt like I'd missed the 75th anniversary of the UK Warehousing Association because that occurred under my predecessor and there was a big, celebration then. And I was wondering to myself, am I still going to be here when we turn 100? That's maybe the next biggie. But of course, you can celebrate any anniversary that you choose to. And so we took this theme from Jules Verne's famous book, Around the World in 80 Days. And we took this to allow us to celebrate the 80-year anniversary of UKWA with this idea of a kind of intrepid adventure. And in the novel, the adventurer himself learns something about himself through that experience, and he becomes more kind of open and embracing of the future. And so once I'd completed all 80 visits, it took me ages. I started in January and wrapped them up in October during 2024. But once I'd completed the 80, we did do a kind of retrospective in the sense that we brought out a deck of cards that we call warehouse trumps that feature some of the places that I went to. But when it came to writing about it, I thought it might be a bit dull to just create a narrative that says, and then I went to this warehouse, and then I went to the next warehouse, and then I went somewhere else, because it was fun to do, but not so good to read about. So I thought I would try and reflect instead on what it has taught me about the future and what I think might be coming next in our wonderful industry.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that intro. And like, yeah, absolutely love the association with the adventure book because I feel like, yeah, sometimes our industry definitely feels like it. And for anyone that hasn't kind of followed you on LinkedIn, you can definitely still kind of go back and see kind of the whole history of Claire's travels and all the fantastic sites that she's seen. I think that the white paper is kind of structured in different chapters, kind of pretty much kind of introducing different kind of trends and predictions that you have. So we'll try and follow a little bit that, but obviously we might go into areas that you haven't probably kind of fully covered in the white paper. But
Mhm.
maybe to start off, one element of that you talk a lot about is how consumer expectations have changed. And from your visits, how did you find that they've influenced the way warehousing operations are kind of evolving as well, especially in today's day and age with like the AI enabled supply chains kind of pretty much kind of flourishing. So yeah, what's that connection between the customer expectation and what you're seeing on the ground?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that through the experience of the pandemic, the general public became a bit more familiar with the idea that the operations in warehouses are actually what supports their quality of life. You know, a warehouse isn't just a necessary evil, it's a really critical part of how the economy works. So I think we can feel positive about that. But I think there are also some factors where consumer demand is just always getting more and more stringent. So the demand for acquisition of goods, in the capitalist economies at least, is exponentially going up and up and up. But it's just not sustainable to hold enough inventory to be able to fulfill all of those needs without making our management of that inventory much more efficient. Because not only are people wanting to buy a wider assortment of things, but they're expecting a faster fulfillment time as well. And now I think there's something interesting about the way that consumers believe in their own status. So to a certain extent, I would say that we might see some changes where people believe that being frugal is something to be proud of. So it's not necessarily just a necessity if you're living in poverty and struggling with the cost of living, but also that it's a bit old-fashioned and unpleasant to parade your wealth. So living in a more frugal way could be one way that people show their status. We might also see that people get more interested in rental of goods. So rather than just buying things and owning them, some of the things that, have traditionally been owned might be more likely to be rented. So, it's not that uncommon for people to have a car on hire purchase. Perhaps it will become more familiar with white goods like washing machines or televisions, maybe even your toaster, perhaps your shoes and socks, I don't know. And all of that will put a lot more pressure on warehouse operations. But I was also interested, one of the places that I went to was a warehouse where they fulfill physical music. So everybody uses downloads, but actually, no, not everybody uses downloads. And another issue around status that I thought was really interesting was that in Generation Z, people will buy vinyl of Taylor Swift to prove that they're a Swiftie, even if they don't own a record player. So this idea of the acquisition of goods, I think the way that consumers expect to do that is shifting, and we need to have really good inventory management to be able to respond to that.
Very, very interesting. And I think especially when it comes to the rental economy, that's kind of, yeah, absolutely exploded, I think, over the past couple of years. And obviously that kind of brings a completely new different challenge around how do you manage that from a financial perspective is one element, but logistically as well, like returning of those items and refurbishing and then reintroducing them again into the system. I think definitely some really interesting things to come from that angle. But I think maybe jumping a little bit into some kind of the technology supporting obviously the shifts and automation being kind of center stage and to an extent a lot of the conversations obviously we're having is Dexory, of course, but that we're seeing around as well. I think overall, like one of the things you're talking about in the white paper is that you probably see about 10 to 15% of warehouses kind of being automated at the moment. Like, what do you feel are some of the barriers that are preventing that automation to go higher? And yeah, how high do you think that will get later on?
Well, if I had to kind of put a number on it, I'd say perhaps that will double in a decade. Um, but that would still leave the majority of warehouses operating in a more manual way. Of course, I suppose it also depends on your definition of what you mean by technology, because most of the warehouses that I visited had at least some forklift trucks, and that's a type of technology. But the adoption of robotics, I think, it's going to continue, it's going to increase, but it still won't be the majority until maybe a bit later into the century. I think the main driving factors are that people want to make their operations more efficient from a point of view of use of space and use of labor, and robots can help with both of those things. So making better use of land, the land that's given over to industrial uses within the country. We've heard our new government talk a lot about planning permission and the importance of land use being carefully thought through. And making better use of the space is a part of how we play our role in that. But also labour costs are going up, and the availability of labour is becoming tighter. And so the adoption of robotics can help with that. So I think warehouse operators do want to embrace it. But in terms of your question about, why aren't they doing it faster? Well, I suppose some of that will be fear of the unknown. Some of it will be because there's a lot of pressure on the day job, and it can be difficult to find time to make strategic decisions, and to find the financial wherewithal to support that. And also, I think if you're going to have a long-term contract and install a fully automated solution, like some of the warehouses I visited in my tour of 80, you know, that can be a massive project. But it's important not to forget that you can also do a retrofit, introducing some robots into a long-standing operation. And you don't even have to have a massive long contract with your client. Third-party logistics companies can introduce robots, and they should be able to get a decent payback, even if they haven't got a long contract left to run.
Yeah, and I think that kind of is a very interesting point for us as well at Dexory in the sense of kind of using subscription models and robot as a service models, particularly with that in mind. I think kind of going back to what we were discussing earlier about consumer expectation shifting, and obviously I think yeah, industry and economy overall kind of pretty much going from ups to downs like over a span of months now. There is a lot more uncertainty, I think, to an extent, and with that in mind, obviously kind of comes the desire to have, I think, yeah, more ways out or more flexibility when it comes to supplier contracts, whether that's automation or something about else, but especially when it comes to automation. And I think what we're seeing as well with some of the suppliers out there in the robotics field, obviously you prepare a solution for a certain type of goods, and if that good changes, and obviously there's some changes that you have to make to it. But I think maybe moving a little bit into the next theme in your white paper, which is obviously the how 3PL models are evolving, because we touched a little bit on that. Um, how do you feel that maybe they're reacting to the pressure of their own customers to automate more? I mean, we're seeing that a lot in our conversations that yeah, there's expectations for 3PLs to really be at the forefront of innovation, have a lot of technology in, like really embrace that. Is that something that you've seen out in the field in your visits?
Yeah, I think there are certainly some clients that are, putting pressure on their 3PLs to be able to introduce more automation. But I think that relationship between a 3PL and their client is also really interesting to explore. I mean, there's this old saying that people buy from people. Um, and to a certain extent, that's true. But then we've got to think about, some of these platforms like eBay's been around since 1995. People are not buying from someone that they know and trust. They're buying through a digital platform. You've got Airbnb and Vinted were both set up in 2008. I had no idea Vinted was that old, actually, Oana. I've only recently started using it, but I love it. And we've had Uber since 2010. And in all of these cases, I think we're quite reliant on first of all, the ubiquity of the digital platform. So everybody has to be a digital native, to be able to have a level of trust in using the platform. But also you have things like ratings and stars and reviews and those sorts of things, which help as proof points and help to build trust. And in the academic literature, there's quite a lot at the moment about this concept called ODW, on-demand warehousing, or more colloquially, it's described as a pallet hotel. So the very first of my 80 visits, I went to Viscu, and they have a site in Wellingborough, which they describe as a pallet hotel, where you don't have to have a long-term contract for storage at all. So, in the literature, there's this idea that there will be a rise in on-demand warehousing, which is a bit more like that sort of digitized buying or procurement method that we've become more used to as consumers. But I do wonder whether maybe UKWA has a role there in helping to provide those social proof points. And I also think more generally, we're seeing a rise in 3PL. So companies like, for example, Currys that make white goods, they used to do all of their own warehousing, and maybe 4 or 5 years ago, they outsourced the whole thing to GXO in order to tap into the expertise of a 3PL. And we've done some work with Savills looking at warehouse buildings and who's occupying them. And we're definitely seeing a sharp rise in 3PL occupants, which again seems to imply that you'll be relying more on third-party experts, but the type of contract that you have with them might be different. And I suppose that has implications for Dexory as well.
100%, yes. And I think, yeah, without kind of giving too much away, but it's fantastic usually when we do work with 3PLs and then obviously we meet their customers and then their customers then want to see our solution in other 3PLs they have in other markets. And then, yeah, it's a great way to kind of grow the business. So I'm very, very happy to kind of see those relationships flourishing. But I was just thinking one point that you touched on a little bit earlier and kind of connects the two a little bit is potentially how all the digital tools and some of the elements of well, automation or like data collection, some of the elements that we're doing as well can actually help improve that relationship between customer and 3PL and bring a lot more trust and transparency. So I think versus, for instance, when we started working with the industry, so we're like almost 24 months ago now, it's like, yeah, time just flies. And there was a lot of reticence around kind of sharing data between the 3PL and the customer. See, what we're doing is we're collecting information that might show errors and might show mistakes. And obviously the 3PL was very, very cautious in kind of like, yeah, sharing that with the customer. Now that's changed a lot. And obviously there's kind of a joint effort to try and mitigate those and work together on. So I wonder if kind of, yeah, digitization actually just brings a lot more trust and transparency, which then potentially can get customers to use even more 3PLs, if that's kind of a bit of a circle in the
Yeah, I think
conversation.
that is possible. I mean, one of the places that I visited was in South Wales, and it was operated by Metro Supply Chain, and they were working in the defence supply chain. And you can imagine that the security standards are very high indeed when you're supplying the parts into a tank manufacturing factory, and they're making tanks to send over to Ukraine. High levels of security, but also you have to have some transparency of data. So I think people can take comfort from the fact that this isn't a brand new idea. There are protocols for how you can share data, but you do have to have a certain amount of transparency and sharing in order to be able to meet customer service levels. And I suppose, again, that's where Dexory comes in.
Indeed. Thank you so much for that. Maybe kind of moving on a little bit more to one of the other predictions, which talks a lot about how the workforce is evolving. I think, yeah, we touched before in some of the conversations we've had together and some of the panels that we've been on around upskilling and how do we make sure that obviously the workforce of today is prepared for all the changes coming their way. I mean, the white paper kind of covers 2025, 2050, so it's quite obviously a whole kind of generation in there that will change. How do you feel that that needs to evolve, and like how much responsibility do all parties have in that to try and make sure that obviously kind of everyone stays up to speed with how things are evolving?
Well, one of the things that sort of provoked me to think about the future warehouse workforce was a novel that I read by an American author called Rob Hart. And he wrote this novel called The Warehouse. So, of course, I was intrigued. I thought, I need to read this book. And in there, he paints this picture of a horribly dystopian future where there's one big dominant employer and they exploit their workforce, making them do tedious, dangerous work, and taking them for granted, paying them peanuts in this sort of soulless campus in the middle of nowhere. And it's set in the near future. So I guess in this period between 2025 and 2050. And I was reflecting on that, just thinking, it's a good novel. I would recommend you to read it, but it doesn't sound right to me. I don't think that is what the future holds for us. And so, that sort of prompted me to think, what is the future going to be like? One of the things that stood out for me was I went to Amethyst, one of our member companies down in Kent, and they'd built an employee garden in the grounds of their warehouse. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. I haven't seen that before. And then not long after, I went to a Kuehne Nagel warehouse in the East Midlands, and they'd also built an employee garden. And I thought, well, that's not what Rob Hart's talking about in his novel. And it seems as though the worker is being more centrally recognised as a stakeholder in the warehouse property. So we're seeing better quality welfare facilities, nicer canteens, decent toilets with proper showers. Those sorts of facilities indicate to me that, people who work in warehouses are being better recognised, as they rightly should be. And not necessarily just the workforce. I mean, I also visited a Renus warehouse in Nuneaton where they built sports pitches available for the employees, but even for the local community, so that you're sort of building those bridges and providing something extra. I've seen gyms. I haven't actually seen a creche, but I've heard it talked about that people might install a creche to be able to support their workforce that way. So I think workers will increasingly feel like a warehouse is a great place to work. But I'm also interested in the idea that robots might take away some of the low-skilled tasks, because I think that's a bit of a double-edged sword. So I'll start by just saying, Oana, I have a real personal beef with the idea of a low-skilled worker. I think that's rubbish. I think there's no such thing as a low skilled worker. First of all, some skills like manual dexterity are very, very important in entry level jobs in warehouses, and you can't say that's not a skill. But secondly, often in the course of a shift or a week or time that is spent in a warehouse, you'll find yourself doing some mundane and repetitive tasks, but in amongst those tasks, if something goes wrong, you've got to be able to troubleshoot, make decisions, escalate, communicate, and all of those things, that's things that your more skilled and experienced workers will do better than the people who are brand new and haven't done it before. And to me that seems obvious that, well, that there is no such thing as a low skilled job. But we do have some entry level jobs where there are low skilled tasks. Some robots will potentially take over some of those tasks. But I think that has the opportunity to make things even better for people because, they'll get to do more of that troubleshooting stuff, which is the more fun part of the job anyway, and the bit which humans are better suited to. So I hope that that will be a good sign, and perhaps it will also help us on our journey towards creating a more diverse workforce in the warehouse as well. I know a friend of mine, Kirsten Tisdale from Arisha, is working with Cranfield University to do some research about the way in which the introduction of more automation might make the warehouse jobs more accessible for women. So I think that's an interesting idea to study, and I'll be interested to see what she finds out.
No, that's a very, very interesting kind of point. And I think we've already seen some examples. I think I quite recently kind of saw something on LinkedIn as well. Obviously, kind of gender is one element, but also allowing people with disabilities to do some of these roles that obviously kind of the fundamental thinking initially is a warehouse would require you to be able to be mobile, be able to pick things up, move things around, obviously to a certain level of safety, but still it's not necessarily the most kind of friendly for people with disabilities. Whereas obviously with robotics and some other technologies like exoskeletons and so on, it could kind of open up that obviously the market for a lot more people that can now potentially kind of have access to these roles, which they wouldn't before.
Another place that I visited, which was brilliant, was ILG. So they're a subsidiary of USAN, and they do some work with an organisation called the Oldingbourne Trust. And at the warehouse visit, I went to see the baler. So the baler is the place where, cardboard and plastic gets baled up, ready to be sold off. And it's to do with, packaging materials being recycled. And it's normally the most messy part of any warehouse. The baler at ILG was absolutely spotless, and it was operated by a guy who was autistic. And he had been employed through this relationship they have with Oldingbourne. I have never seen such a neat and tidy area. And this guy took so much pride in making sure that even when you're doing a job that could be quite mucky, if you've got somebody with that sort of neurodiversity, perhaps they're bringing something that the neurotypical couldn't do. So yeah, other opportunities for diversity there.
Really, really interesting, and like kind of excited to see how this is gonna evolve. And I think maybe because you touched a little bit on kind of the other side of the spectrum and the packaging and all of that element, obviously sustainability is another very kind of key theme of like some of the things that you're covering as part of the Warehouse of Tomorrow theme. I think maybe kind of do you feel like there was a bit of a contradiction between the need for speed, the great demands, and obviously also the expectations to become more and more sustainable and kind of keep the environment in mind? How do you find the industry is trying to kind of balance the two?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, these warehouses that are being constructed right now, they're definitely going to be still in use in 2050, 2075, maybe even beyond. So we've got to be thinking now about how we're going to be part of the net zero economy that we're heading for. And, part of that is about making better use of space, which is where automation can definitely help. Alongside that, at UKWA, we've done a lot of work campaigning about installing more solar panels on warehouse rooftops. And I've been, in some ways, disappointed that it's still quite a low penetration into that market, but also enthused to see that some of the warehouses I visited have really embraced that. And despite the fact that it's sometimes difficult to get the right permits and that sort of thing, there are solar installations on warehouse rooftops. Some of the warehouses, the older ones that I've visited from the 60s and 70s, would have been built at a time where our national grid was almost entirely coal-fired power stations. And the electricity grid of the future is going to be so different. And the demand for electricity within warehouses is going to go up, obviously, because people are switching away from fossil fuel powered forklifts towards electrically powered, but also because of the introduction of robots. I mean, your Dexory robots require electricity. And alongside that, although it wasn't part of my visit of 80, I did actually go to a warehouse in Kuwait in 2023.
Thing. Yeah.
Um, and they were storing ambient goods, but they had temperature control equipment because when, the climate goes above, I think they said 35 degrees C, which is not uncommon in the Middle East, then they have to temperature control the goods. And if we're going to be victims of climate change, that could eventually be the case here in the UK as well. So the demand for electricity, I think, is only going in one direction. And we need to be really on the front foot about making sure that we're generating electricity where we've got the opportunity to do that. I think as well, when we think about storage media, there's a trade-off between using pallet shuttles, for example, which have quite a low energy demand, but are also quite slow on throughput of goods, versus an ASRS system with cranes, which has got a higher demand for electricity, but also, it's quicker to operate. Perhaps our increasing interest in the environment will lead us to come up with new types of storage medium. So maybe there's going to be something new in the next 20, 30 years. And I suppose we'll have to think of ways that we can manage the inventory and use Dexory robots for that too.
And I mean that's a very good kind of segue into kind of my next question and kind of theme around data because I mean you touched on it at the beginning around parts of kind of being more sustainable as being more efficient, and that's whether it's with the space, with obviously kind of people movement, with machinery, because if you can kind of reduce the amount of movements you have in a site, still kind of keeping the throughput, then automatically obviously consumption kind of reduces as well, which can be a little bit every single day, but obviously considering some of these sites are millions of square feet and square meters actually. We're talking about like, yeah, quite a lot of movement. I think, why do you think data is still kind of king in warehousing? And based on your experience, I mean, over the years, like, do you find that the industry is getting better at collecting and using data to make decisions, or is it still a lot of gut feel, experience-based kind of decision making in the sites that you visited?
Well, I would encourage people to take the Warehouse Manager Certificate of Professional Competence, which is a new UKWA qualification, and that sort of provides some of the tools that people can rely on to make good use of data. If you go back 100 years, goods didn't really have data with them. To us in our current economy, we're used to the idea that food allergens and ingredients are listed on things that you buy in the supermarket. If you buy fashion and apparel, you can tell, what material it's made of and what's the country of origin. All of those are kind of new ideas that have only really been around maybe since the 60s. If we go more towards this rental model that we talked about earlier, or more towards the recycled and pre-loved goods, then I think the demand for data will go up. And when I say that, if you think about the importance of provenance in markets that already have a strong second-hand market, so there are lots of cars are bought second-hand, but you have to have the full service history. People buy retro and vintage clothes, but you still have to have the designer label to sort of demonstrate that provenance. So I think the availability of data is going to be something that becomes increasingly important. Something I find kind of interesting is if you go onto Google and search for the circular economy, there's like a section where you can search for images. All Google's images of the circular economy are infographics. So no one can show you a photo of what the circular economy actually looks like in practice. But I know what it looks like because on my visits, I've seen the circular economy and it looks like a warehouse. And it tends to be, it will have a look as though it's quite chaotic because the goods aren't all pristine and they're not all similar to one another. One of the most interesting visits that I made was to a UKWA member called the Felix Project.
Indeed,
Now,
yeah. Yeah.
if you've got obsolete food or goods that you'd like to donate to a food bank, I'd definitely encourage that. But for manufacturers, they might find they've got 26 pallets of something, and there's not a food bank in the land that can accept 26 pallets of whether it's, tins of beans or bottles of beverages or even fresh fruit. They can't accept those volumes, but the Felix Project can. They're a warehouse operation across London and they work with 1,000 charities. And that's the circular economy in practice. And it relies on a lot of data because day to day they don't know what they're receiving. But as soon as they do receive it, they've got to decide what can be distributed where. And I'll just give you one other example to do with data, which I also found interesting. I went to a UKWA member in Essex called the Commodity Centre, and they store tea and coffee, and that comes in containerized from all over the world in huge sacks of coffee beans and tea leaves, and these sacks can weigh up to 60 kilos. And historically that was a manual activity to take those sacks out of the container because they're not palletized. They make good use of the container space by filling it to the gunnels with the sacks just piled on top of one another. And they'd introduced an exoskeleton. So the guys using the exoskeleton, that helps them to offload those goods without taking so much of the strain themselves. They wear it as a kind of suit, and it helps them to do the heavy lifting. And I was curious because I thought there might be an element of bravado where they would have preferred to do the job manually. And so I said, what was it about this exoskeleton that encouraged you to try it out? First of all, they said the very first time we tried it on, it was comfortable. If it hadn't been comfortable, we would have taken against it. We wouldn't have been bought into the idea. But secondly, they said, we're strong guys and we could do this work already without it. But what we found was at the end of the shift, we're not so fatigued. We've got a better quality of life because we can spend more time with our families and, and feel strong enough to go out to the park or cook dinner or whatever it is. And so there were these sort of two aspects which had encouraged them to adopt it. But the company that make the exoskeletons have also pointed out that they provide a lot of data. You can find who exactly is lifting what kind of weights and where is that being done, and even to the extent that you can identify where people could make changes to their posture that could improve their safety when lifting. So I think that's just one other example of how data is increasingly important and more available than ever before.
No, very, very interesting. I mean, obviously, we thrive in the data environment and always kind of, I would say, well, geek out in kind of looking at everything that we can find on a customer site and how they can optimize every single bit. So I can appreciate they will do the same for obviously like any equipment coming in. But I think first of all, before we jump on the next theme, I just wanted to remind our listeners that if you do have any questions for myself or Claire, please post them into the chat. My colleague will pick them up and we'll come back to you just after the webinar. So of course, after that, as we share it online, please feel free to use LinkedIn or the other platforms. But just as a reminder, do that. And going back to kind of that collaboration between people and technology, obviously one of the big themes in chapter 7 in the white paper talks about the collaborative between human and robots. I think, do you find that there's still misconceptions around this in the warehousing space around how human and robots can work together? And as kind of industry leaders ourselves, like, do you think there's something that we could do to address that?
Well, first of all, I would say that sometimes managers underestimate their workers and they say that people will be resistant to change. Perhaps what the workers are resistant to is that the change is going to be done to them and they'll be treated as though they can't be party to it. And that's probably a mistake. I think people working in warehouses, even those who maybe don't have a high level of education, will nevertheless be very digitally literate. Most people in the workforce these days are familiar with using computerized systems. Most people have got a mobile phone or at least have used a mobile phone. And of course, these modern phones have so many apps on them. Digital literacy is the norm. And if people can be part of the introduction of robotics, I think they find it exciting. There's some research by Boston Consulting Group that says only about 30% of people feel anxious about the impact of AI on their job. Most people actually feel quite excited about how, artificial intelligence could help to make jobs more rewarding and more fruitful. So I think people will increasingly embrace robots as co-workers. It's kind of modern as well, isn't it? It will make the warehouse seem like a more modern and exciting place to be if it's populated by robots and you can work alongside them, almost like being on the Starship Enterprise. And one other point about it is I think perhaps the government and the unions might be a bit behind the times because we're hearing a lot of rhetoric about how damaging and dangerous 0 hours contracts could be. And remember, I've read Rob Hart's novel, and I know that there is there's a version of the future which could be quite dangerous and horrible. But actually, perhaps the gig economy is going to be more prevalent in future in a way which is helpful to individuals. Perhaps with digital platforms, they'll be able to sell their services by picking which shifts they want to work according to a kind of dynamic decision making on the part of the individual, where they might say, well, I don't want to work 8 hours today. I'd rather work 6 hours. And I'll pick the employer that's offering that kind of work. Or, I'd like to do some physical work today, but I'd like to be working sitting at a desk or even remotely somewhere in Bali on a different day. So perhaps the way that the gig economy works and the way that labor becomes available is going to change. And I would suggest that the warehouse companies that are open to that idea and are thinking about ways they could tap into that might be the ones that are going to be most successful.
Very, very interesting point. I think kind of touching on the robotics element that we were discussing earlier around potentially being able to operate those remotely and not having to be in the warehouse all the time. I think there's definitely some opportunities there around that human to machine collaboration that kind of changes a little bit the need for the physicality aspect. So I was kind of having to be under the same roof to be able to operate. But very, very excited to kind of see how this is all going to pan out. I think maybe just a final question. Is there any kind of additional kind of learning or aha moment that you had that maybe you didn't capture in the white paper that you like to add, or any other kind of thought that you want to leave us as we kind of start a really kind of crazy year ahead, I would say.
I would say there are a couple of things. So the first thing that was like a silver thread that ran through all of the visits was the customer focus. So many of the places I visited were 3PL, and so their customer is the owner of the goods that are being stored. And those guys were always so keen to talk to me about how they would bend over backwards to create a solution which really works for their customer. And of course, you mentioned that yourself, that the transparency and availability of information that Dexory provide can be part of how you meet the customer's needs. And the other thing which it's made me reflect on is what's the role of a trade association in this new world? And I'm excited because I think UKWA has a strong foundation, but we're also not afraid to change ourselves, and we should be able to support our members going forward into this brave new world of the future of warehousing.
No, it's very, very interesting. And I think from our collaboration over the past couple of years, what I find very interesting with you is obviously that kind of always focusing on connecting, on trying to kind of educate and bring together both kind of the supplier side and also obviously kind of the warehousing side, and always kind of making those introductions to find out like what's the best for kind of any of your members. Obviously without kind of any forceful conversations, but more like being able to be that facilitator and the hub at the center of the industry that brings everyone together and facilitates those networking opportunities, which I mean personally has helped us so much to learn about the sector and the industry when we had no idea about what warehousing is when we started a few years ago, and now obviously kind of like seeing so many ourselves as well, not just in the UK but around the world. We can definitely say that I've not seen such an incredible association anywhere else globally, to be honest, that's so much at the heart of its members. So just a big thank you for everything you're doing for all of us.
That's very kind of you. Thank you, Anna. And as you know, we love working with you too.
Thank you. Perfect. Well, I think kind of that sums up our webinar today. But as I mentioned earlier, any questions that you have for myself or Claire, definitely feel free to put them in and we'll make sure to come back to you. We will have a link of the white paper and also our own kind of Dexory versions of the predictions with just 2025 rather than such a kind of big span of 25 years that the UKWA has put out. But feel free to download the two materials and similarly let us know what you think of them. Thank you so much, everyone, for listening, and see you soon for a new episode.